All right, everybody, let's get started. Thank you for rejoining us here for our keynote. This is going to be very brief as well, in keeping with our pressed time. But I'm really excited to welcome for our keynote Peter Gill Case, 83, who is the principal of Truthbox Architects here in Providence, and is responsible for some of the most forward-thinking building and design work that's been going on in our fair city in the last, 10 or 15 years, 20 years. And he's been a great friend to the program over the years here and there, helping us to think about our relationship with Providence. And so it was Peter who I really thought of first when I thought who would be the person to give the keynote, to welcome you back to Providence, to give you a sense of what's happening here if you've been gone for a while. Some of you are still around here, so you can be the ones to fight with him about what's really going on in Providence. I'll leave that to you. But for those of you who've been gone a while, he's a great resource for thinking about some of the changes and things that have happened. So with that, please welcome Peter Gill Case.
3 years ago, during the pandemic, I was walking my dog through our empty campus. On this very weekend, campus dance, on the Friday, this very day. It's a much better weekend with all you guys here in Providence. Welcome back. I'm pleased to have been asked by Sandy, Professor Zipp in the Urban Studies Department, to help celebrate the milestone of 50 years. Also, I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak in front of so many alumni. And here's to the graduates. Congratulations to all of you, faculty, students, past and present, and to anyone else who's had a hand in shaping this department over the years. To me, it seems, and especially after this robust conversation that we just participated in today, that the department is keeping up with the times and with ways in which the cities are changing. Thank you to the excellent panelists, and I look forward to having more conversations with you all after this. I wish to cite two works I was introduced to as part of my urban studies experience at Brown. A Theory of Good City Form by Kevin Lynch, published while I was a student, which helped me to bridge the worlds between urban planning and architecture. And Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, whose imagination is liberating to those of us who need to be reminded not to be too rigidly scientific and judgmental. All of the rocky and metallic material we stand on, the iron in our blood, the calcium in our teeth, the carbon in our genes, were produced billions of years ago in the interior of a red giant star. We are made of star stuff. Providence has changed since you left. Whichever decade that was, or if you left at all. First, the highway was demolished, removed, rebuilt, and opened in 2010, creating 44 acres of land between downtown and the Jewelry District. By the way, the Jewelry District is not called the Jewelry District anymore by many. That's a little bit of a tussle. Streets were reconnected with themselves. Transportation around the city changed to being more pedestrian and bike friendly. This was due in part to an opportunity to modify, reshape the city blocks, but also is in part to really strong leadership in the city planning department. I know Bob Azar is here. Where are you, Bob? There's a deputy director right there. As a developer and architect, it's It's underestimated. I've got to make sure to give credit where credit is due. If you have a strong planning department, it makes a world of difference. We have a pedestrian bridge now, built on the same piers where the old highway crossed the river, and now there's a park. And with new adjacencies in the slowly transforming town, old buildings take on new appearances. When you get a chance to walk about, you may feel a bit disoriented at first. Meanwhile, Brown crossed the river in a big way. The med school is just one component of the university that doesn't call College Hill home. Brown owns 39 properties on the city side of the river, roughly 100 acres, has invested $340 million to date in infrastructure and brought new jobs to the area. That's all I will say here. The expansion of Brown in Providence is a topic for another day. One of the biggest changes is one you can't see. It's a set of tunnels that are helping to keep pollutants out of our bay. The third and final stage is under construction now. Before the tunnels, everything you could imagine was flowing through a combined stormwater and sewer system which overwhelmed the treatment plants. You won't be able to see it, but you might be able to appreciate our clean bay. The project has cost overruns, it has critics, but it's a classic urban infrastructure project that doubles as a climate resiliency project for years to come. In short, my message to you is get out there while you're here and get to see the latest version of Providence. As long as I can remember, I have been enchanted, disgusted, entranced, and mesmerized by cities. Not just being in cities, but traveling from one to another, comparing them. As a boy, my friend and I would ride bikes, walk, and take the subway to wherever we could go in Boston. The harbor was foul back then, but its putrid waters lapped the pylons of empty piers where big ships once docked. And we were captivated. We made mental maps. We got lost. We sketched. And we'd ride the subway to the end and find a horse track or a beach and come home again. We'd ride our bikes till our legs ached, cursing the random sections of cobblestones that appeared when you'd least expect them. There was so much active wandering to do around the city in the middle of this historic moment of decline and decay that many older cities faced. Emboldened by my more reckless counterpart, I learned to balance my fear of urban dangers with the anticipation of making a new discovery, together with some lost and broken, beautiful corner of the city. Adults ignored us mostly. It was the other kids we had to worry about. Our troubles were thankfully few. It wasn't uncommon for us to miscalculate and to be miles from home at dinner time. I grew up going off course regularly. It's a metaphor. But what we always found our way back. My city explorations continued in Providence while attending Brown. I discovered the live music scene, Professor Teichert. Lupo's, the old Met Cafe in the living room. There were also late night places to eat. And even though we'd get grief being college students, it wasn't an unwelcoming scene. As part of my Brown experience, I also spent a semester at NYU doing field work on the gentrification in Chinatown and repeated my meandering approach to the urban experience in the lower portion of Manhattan. After college, it was a recession. I sought a job as an urban planner without finding one. So I became a math teacher and lived in the mountains and overseas and stayed in education for 10 years, including a job that brought me back to Providence 6 years after graduation. The work was rewarding. I taught math. I often referred to art in my lessons, and eventually I got the clue that I should enroll in an architecture program, which I did at RISD for a master's degree. Having gravitated back to the city as a teacher, I was compelled to pursue a more direct relationship with urbanity. My awareness of climate change occurred around the same time I was becoming an architect. But I was still mostly in denial. My architecture work is always focused on sustainable design. And back then, I was aware of the enormous waste generated by buildings, of the promise of renewable energy and energy efficiency to make housing more affordable and more comfortable. Also, there was always air, water, noise, and light pollution to contend with. Lastly, energy independence was an even bigger issue then. It felt good to help reduce the need on foreign oil. I spent my early years as an architect working on multiple mill projects. I first learned about the notion of embodied energy from preservationists, arguing to save the existing building stock, such as textile mills and steel mills from being demolished. Embodied energy is the sum of the energy consumed to produce an object. For example, the Crook Point Bridge on the Seekonk River between Providence and East Providence was built in 1908 and has been stuck in the open position since 1976. The amount of embodied energy in the bridge includes the energy it took to mine, produce, deliver, and erect the steel in the bridge, and that includes the labor as well. To a lesser degree, it also includes the wood and concrete components. It also includes the energy to open and close it for nearly 70 years it was in service. This is one example of how to calculate embodied energy. A solar panel has embodied energy also. There are a host of minerals to be mined and to be fabricated into its component parts. It takes 3 years of the panel producing energy before the solar panel becomes carbon neutral. All things have embodied energy. The clothes you wear, the food you eat, the chair you are sitting in, all took someone to grow or mine the materials and put the components together and transport it to you or you to it. We'll come back to this in a moment. I settled on a business partner and we worked on renovations of abandoned buildings and new construction on vacant city lots. This is commonly known as green urban infill. One building we demolished for a new project was 90% recycled because it was all steel and all concrete. For the most part, we only demolished portions of the buildings we worked with, which each site offered. Even though we recognize that it takes embodied energy to produce materials such as lumber, bricks, paint, and hot water heaters, by building in empty city lots, we were supporting urban density and helping to contain urban sprawl and protecting forests and farmlands. The first time I accepted climate change was happening was when I heard Jim Hansen of NASA speak in 2000, around the time I became a licensed architect. Here was this scientist showing us charts of global warming, and for the first time, I was unable to deny it. I had heard about climate change before, but each time it receded from my consciousness after a minute or an hour or a week. After Hansen, the reality began to penetrate my thinking and my way of life. Even so, my work didn't immediately respond to climate change. I did become more adamant as an advocate for sustainable architecture and devoted more learning to the sources and uses of energy. Also, architects were exploring and developing ways to reduce embodied energy, upcycle products into the buildings, and use fewer plastics, things like that. My partner, Jordan Durham, and I built our development business by combining design and construction under one roof. We built offices, housing, retail spaces, a food co-op. We became known as reasonable developers. Not too greedy, someone once told me. Each project got a little bigger and we hit our stride. Around 2018, 2019, two things happened in my life. Jordan and I competed for a big real estate development opportunity, and I began to explore climate activism. Rhode Island has a strong and feisty coalition of folks from around the state who had gotten my attention at various protests. They were planning to protest banks that had funded fossil fuel projects. Why, I wondered. Simple, they said. Without banks and insurance company, the fossil fuel industry can't expand, and we need to stay within our carbon budget. Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, global banks have funneled $4.6 trillion into fossil fuels, $1.2 trillion from the top 4 US banks alone. There was a growing movement to pressure banks to stop funding these projects, and Rhode Island groups were organizing protests at local branches of national banks. So I joined a few of those protests. As time passed, I got deep enough into the topic and ended up attending a small conference of national leaders and stayed involved in climate finance. Once, when we met with the chief sustainability officer at JP Morgan Chase, he pointed out that they were the largest funder of green energy on the planet, even though his graph showed that his loans to the fossil fuel industry were twice as much. A report that just came out last fall shows large corporations realized a huge increase in their carbon footprint just by including their cash holdings at these large banks. For example, Disney, Meta, Google, and Microsoft all saw their carbon footprints double from what they had been measuring just because they hadn't included the cash these companies hold in their banks. In 2018, Jordan and I were awarded the rights to build on one of the newly formed parcels created after the highway was moved, a full city block, so-called Parcel 6. We were ecstatic and worked on the design and the development process with abandon. It was to be 3 times larger than the biggest project we had completed to date. The project fit all of our development criteria. I imagine many of you are familiar with this list of how we're going to get to net zero carbon future by 2050. But let's just go through it anyway. Energy efficiency, renewable energy transition, forest conservation and reforestation, sustainable agriculture, circular economy to reduce waste, climate resilience and adaptation, carbon pricing and policies, technological innovation, international cooperation. Whew. Okay. Now, here's a map of all the active fossil gas pipelines in the country. If we are strategically trying to move away from gas, why should we need to build another pipeline, even for the short term? We have the resources and the infrastructure to manage the transition away from gas. What many would argue is the one item that should be on top of the list we just read, since we have enough oil and gas in existing wells to help bridge us to net zero future, is stop all new fossil fuel infrastructure. Each new investment made by the industry locks in emissions for decades to come and blows through our carbon budget. Meanwhile, the industry is doing all that it can to continue to grow without regard to greenhouse gas emissions, including misinforming the public. More on that later. There are groups that fund what's called the front lines in the climate fight. Communities that live closest to the existing facilities, where pollution has created chronic health crises, such as what's known as Cancer Alley, between New Orleans and Baton Rouge in Louisiana. Nobody makes a more compelling argument to stop the build-out than these people in these areas, suffering from the excesses of the industrial development in their neighborhoods. Even industry fears this constituency as much as it fears government regulation. Meanwhile, as the construction date for Parcel 6 neared, I slowly became upset and angry. But I didn't know why. When I saw the first earth-moving machines on the site, I felt sick to my stomach. Then it hit me. somewhere I had crossed a line where I no longer felt like a champion of enlightened development, or a champion for the environment, or a fighter to reduce climate change. The production of steel and concrete accounts for 15% of all carbon emissions in the world, and our project had tons and tons of both. Not to mention the rest of the energy from the CO2 emissions from all of the other materials, all to be built on a patch of grass. Personal turmoil aside, construction began after the pandemic and continued during the worst of it. Luckily for the project, all of the work at that stage was outdoors, primarily building on the parking deck and the building foundations, and that phase of work proceeded on schedule. I held on to the conviction that we were developing this project in part so someone else would not have the chance, and that our approach was best for the city we love. Also, we were still hitting our guidelines for good development. Still, by becoming fully aware of the inherent conflict of building in the age of climate change, I experienced a new level of conflict that persists to this day. I remain uncertain how this will affect my approach to real estate development. In the past 2 years, I've traveled to some of the places in this country where climate frontline groups have already made a difference, such as the Dakota Access Pipeline in the Midwest, and to places where protests are still going on, like Appalachia and the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and Texas. I've been to a place where there's no protest at all. The largest fossil gas reserve in the world is in West Texas and New Mexico, and it is known as the Permian Basin, where the local environmental agencies are sympathetic to the industry and regulations are lax and barely enforced. There I met a woman who is known as the methane hunter. Methane is the name for what the industry euphemistically calls natural gas. She is the only one in thousands of square miles who reports on the massive leaks uncontrolled by the industry. She uses a special camera called an optical gas imaging camera that can detect methane where the naked eye can see nothing. If one includes the leaks in evaluating the extraction and uses of methane, methane is as bad or worse as any other source of fossil fuel. When the Crook Point Bridge was built in 1908, the cost presumably didn't include the damage to the environment at the iron ore mines, or the coal mines, or at the steel mills, causing air and water pollution, or the cost of black lung disease to the mining communities. These costs are often considered externalities in economics, not to be included in the calculation of gross domestic product or economic gain or loss. Partha Dasgupta, an eminent economist and author of the Dasgupta Review of the Economics of Biodiversity, argues that these costs are essential in today's climate-focused economics. He argues it's like a soccer team that only counts the goals it scores, but not the goals it gives up, in order to determine whether the team wins or loses. He concludes that we must incorporate the environmental costs of resource use and pollution into economic decision-making. This can be achieved through measures like carbon pricing and pollution taxes, which incentivize businesses and individuals to reduce their environmental impact. Another related point from Dasgupta: invest in natural capital, conserve and restore natural habitats, protect biodiversity, and value ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, clean air, and water regulation. Some of these suggestions were borne out in the recent past during the pandemic, a catastrophic event that transformed the world for a relatively short time. Collectively, we cataloged many observations and incubated many new ideas, some of which we've discussed earlier, in the past 3 years. Some of these ideas were excellent. Unfortunately, some of the best ideas learned from the multiple crises have already been discarded, and we can barely recall they even existed. The urban experience was vastly different during the pandemic. Quiet cities brought nature back. Birds seemed to sing more loudly, and animal sightings happened more frequently. Clean cities brought back fresh air to breathe, and vistas endemically hidden by smog. Remote meetings reduced commuting. Families spent more time together. There was even a momentary reordering of who were the most important members of the community. Healthcare workers, teachers, first responders topped the list. The pandemic brought misery, but it also brought new insights about survival, community, and how to thrive without uncontrolled growth. What is your story about the great urban experiment that just happened? What did you learn, and how does it translate into today's busy world? To me, what we learned is that the economy is directly tied to exploiting nature, which is directly tied to climate change. When the fossil fuel economy stopped, we all breathed a sigh of relief. Back in our Providence, our project is done. 50% of the apartments are workforce housing. It's the most energy efficient group of buildings of that size in the state. I have come to embrace my misgivings, and I look to learn from the experience. It's beyond my boyhood dreams to have been a part of shaping any city, especially this one. Affordable housing is one way to slow gentrification. Energy efficiency is another. Mechanical ventilation keeps indoor air fresh, and the living spaces are insulated from the city noises below and the highway beyond. What I do next in the realm of urban design and development remains to be seen. I question growth for growth's sake. But I remain committed to the path of creating more affordable and resilient housing. The science of embodied energy and the cost of nature are both firmly co-located in my guiding principles. I believe I speak for many others when I say I'm developing an attitude about how to live through this period of slow, simultaneous crises. For better or worse, this is our new way of life. It just is. Also, it's too urgent to rush, meaning we can acknowledge that it's a crisis, but don't start panicking. We have some time to steel ourselves for what lies ahead. Also, there are folks already engaged in the hard work that is having an impact. I am embracing what I call radical acceptance. I'm trying to absorb the magnitude and complexity of the problem without losing my shit. It's true that we all have had some good practice recently. Just look at the past 7 years, for example. Since 2016, we watched the American democratic experiment almost come to an end, experienced the worst pandemic in a century, not to mention weather events that were so catastrophic, new terms had to be invented for them. We have to cut our emissions in half by 2030. But that isn't a mandate for every citizen. It means all of us, collectively. We have to go after the largest and most pernicious sources of energy use and emissions, such as methane leaks from fracking or methane leaks from abandoned oil and gas wells, of which there are hundreds of thousands in this country alone. We also have to continue to detect and label misinformation through corporate advertising and political speeches driven by tone-deaf interest groups. The Climate and Development Lab at Brown University, led by Professor Timmons Roberts, is doing great work, including keeping the spotlight on the delay tactics of the industry. The ironic truth is love of country has been twisted to influence nearly half of this country to ignore climate risk. Social media and myriad information sources make multiple versions of the truth easy to promulgate. We need to support efforts like the Climate and Development Lab to counter the flow of half-truths. If you don't know what to do about climate change, but you're politically savvy, then I would rather have you drive your internal combustion vehicle for another few years if you are driving to strengthen democracy or fight poverty, or the heat island effect, or reducing traffic in the urban core. In other words, use your skill set on whichever front you feel most able to join. As an architect, I'm working on urban resiliency, which is different from then fighting the causes of climate change. There are many direct ways to help humanity during the next phase of a climate-changing world. One project that jogged my imagination is called the Yurt of Invincibility and was set up by private companies from Kazakhstan as a gift to war-torn Ukraine. It consists of traditional nomadic structures that erected to give Ukrainians Kazakh food and tea and a place to charge electronic devices, since the Russian strikes continue to knock out power and heat. Meanwhile, the catastrophic earthquakes in Turkey left huge numbers of survivors homeless and seeking refuge. As an emergency response, some refugees, very few, were invited to occupy ocean liners for shelter and food. While this was a temporary solution, the sight of families being cared for on a huge vessel bound for nowhere implied a solution that could offer possibilities for resiliency in the age of sea level rise. In Providence, the heat island effect has been well documented to be extreme in poorer communities, mostly due to the lack of trees. Temperatures are typically 10 to 20 degrees higher on a hot summer day than in a well-treed community a mile away. Ben Wilson writes about rewilding cities as a climate resiliency tactic to address extreme temperatures and extreme storm events. More trees, more parks, more wetlands, more ecosystems balance all the asphalt and concrete covering the urban floor. He cites urban wild parks in Dallas, Texas, Berlin, and Sheffield, England as examples. It's as if Calvino were writing the narrative. Floating cities, movable cities, quiet cities, clean cities, wild cities, farm cities. And are these to be novel aspects of different cities? Or perhaps different aspects of each city? Who knows? State courts are working to hold fossil fuel companies accountable for having hid from the public for decades that they had documented beyond doubt that human-induced climate change was inevitable. While the industry maintains it's a federal issue, they have lost 20 cases, 20 times at the appellate level, and the Supreme Court recently ruled that cases could proceed at the state level. Who knows how it'll play out? But one common legal perspective is this may be heading towards some large settlements, similar to the tobacco industry in the 1980s. The Climate and Development Lab is one example of what may be the most hopeful prospect yet, which is we are building out the bench of talented people who are moving into positions of leadership to keep the industry in check and to help us all wrestle with the challenging technical, political, and policy issues of our time. The Urban Studies Department is doing the same, helping the leaders of tomorrow grapple with and flourish in the multi-crisis laden world in which we live. My path as a climate activist has infused my work as an urbanist with new meaning. I am not recommending you all drop what you are doing and do the same. I will do my part and look forward to learning more about what brilliant ways you are doing yours. We will be stronger if we appreciate the different ways we can all make cities and civilization thrive in the face of a rapidly warming atmosphere. Cities are inextricably tied to land beyond the city limits. Now we see it more clearly. The impact of a city has on its land and resources 1,000 miles away. There is a cost for not paying for what we use. There are no externalities in a closed system. The earth is a closed system. We have to care for the places that support the urban experience. I suggest we view all our work through the lens of climate change all the time. Take a deep breath. Hold on. It will continue to be a bumpy ride, but it's our journey together. And it's the only vessel we have. Thank you. Sorry, I went a little over. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
We can take a couple questions for Peter before we adjourn. So is anyone one over there? I'm going to run over here and do this. Hang on a second. We have to be recorded.
Thank you. So it looked like from your pictures on Block 6 that you had two things. One was it looked like some of the buildings were CLT or wood buildings, and two, I noticed some bike paths going through that. Could you comment on the carbon footprint, kind of pros and cons of CLT buildings, assuming you were using them? And the second is, given that you're only doing one block, is bike path planning something that you try to incorporate, and has that been successful or not?
Great questions. I'll do the bike path one first. We actually destroyed the bike path on our block and rebuilt it. The city planning department led the effort to modify the transit system to include better bikeways. So that was the bike path that you saw there was there before we made it a construction site. But that path does connect the pedestrian bridge, which connects downtown, to India Point Park, which connects to the ocean and connects to the East Bay bike path. So our little block of bike path is a very significant part of the path connecting the two. Using wood in buildings, not just CLT, but wood, is carbon sequestration. So, it's just any kind of wood, any amount of wood that you're using, the carbon that's in it is being brought into the home, and it's just staying there for a period of time. Even though carbon stays in the atmosphere for a long time, it's still thought that by increasing the amount of wood that you use in a building, like cross-laminated timber or CLT, that that would increase the ability of buildings to become net zero, which is something everybody's striving for.
Everybody else is speechless.
Victoria.
Here, hang on.
Thank you for your presentation. At some point, you showed an image of the sewage and wastewater treatment or separation of the stormwater and sewage system here in Providence. Has a new wastewater treatment plant been part of that effort, or is it just separating the two as they head to water sources and also then to a sewage treatment plant?
So my understanding, and others here in the room may know more than I do, I'm sure they do, that the plan here was to store the water in a large storm event to prevent it from overwhelming the existing treatment plants. There are no new treatment plants that I know of that are on the books at this time. Is that correct? Yeah.
I see the websites here for the Equation Campaign and Bank Forward. Could you just tell us what are those organizations? What do they do?
All right, so this was a soft sell. These are two organizations that I'm involved with that grew up during the pandemic. The first one, it focused on the frontline communities who are doing the work and trying to get money and resources to them. And the second one focuses on climate banking reform.
I'd like to follow up on the banking reform topic.
Sure.
So I'm intrigued by the fact that, you've been to protests in front of banks. You have an antagonistic relationship with the mainstream finance industry, but you're also a real estate developer, and I'm assuming that you don't pay personally. to build these projects. So you alluded to green finance in your talk. Is there an existing green finance movement that is supporting your work, or are you part of creating it?
Thanks for your question. We're involved with, two things. First of all, I think that my protest in front of the banks actually enhances my stature with the banks, ironically. So, because they one thing is really important to know when you talk to bank leadership, it's so surprising. They really, truly believe they're doing the right thing. So when you're talking to them, they think, oh, we're on your side. We're all in this together. I'm serious. That's what they'll say. This is just so, but as far as the green banking movement goes, that's been actually trickier to get off the ground. There's some terrific banks out there, but they're not big enough to provide the services that large corporate clients need. So we have to do both. We have to try to get the big banks to become less supportive of the fossil fuel industry, so that their services could then enhance the corporations, for example, or wealthy people who use them. And then the green banks have to get bigger. The small ones have to get bigger so they can take some of these clients if the big banks won't change.
Probably do like 2 or 3 more.
My name's Lance. I'm class of 2018. I thought that was touching. I really appreciated it, and want to ask a question about kind of disciplinary identity. We started the conversation today about cities and the questions at hand in the 1960s, and urban studies. The unit of analysis has been cities for a long time, and yours is the planet. I think that's very appropriate, and I think the conversation is moving that way, talking about rural areas and the interconnections. And I certainly drove some people crazy writing my thesis in the department about the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Don't get me started.
And I'd like to ask you, how do we navigate that identity question for an urban studies department as our unit of analysis changes? What does urban studies mean when we start talking about the planet?
I'd like to read your paper.
It's not very good.
It's not very good. You're a Brown student. I mean, this is really a question for the department, but if I had my way, if I were there, yes, I would just go ahead and put together rural and urban almost into one word or something. I am really not I'm just not a sprawl guy, right? So in other words, it's almost like you come around and urban and rural, the urban and rural existence are so linked tightly, whereas the sprawl component in the middle isn't, right? It's sort of a parasitical part of the economy. And I do think that if we include nature and rural areas in our understanding of urbanity, right? And just take methane as an example. It's the perfect example. We're still in the cities, we're still being told we have to stay with methane. But right now, the Public Utilities Commission in Rhode Island is trying to decide actually how to wean ourselves off from it, which is very exciting. It's called pruning back the gas network. Imagine a network as like a tree, right? You're just gonna start to, and that's a reality, that's happening. So anyways, if we go ahead and reduce the methane need in the cities, we all of a sudden, those people who are struggling in their smaller cities in the areas of Texas and Louisiana, we're giving them a break too, but we're on this together. That'd be my way.
Who else has questions? Let's do that trick where we take them all and then he can answer them all at once. Okay, let's do these two, John and Daryl.
Great. Well, first, let me congratulate and commend you on your success as a developer designer with climate focus. My question really is more about the how, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about the how you balance, energy efficiency, affordability with financial feasibility and financial sustainability as a developer, and really kind of as a blueprint for others to follow, in your footsteps to create more kind of environmentally sustainable built environments.
You want me to start that one in here? Okay.
Let's let Daryl get in there, and then we'll take them together.
Yeah.
That way we can finish up and get to the main event.
Thank you very much. Daryl Petit, class of '82, Urban Studies. I'm curious about your projects and the sustainability standards that you had to meet or didn't have to meet. And then the larger issue really about how you feel about the sustainability standards that exist right now, the LEED site and Living Building Challenge, and where we've gotten to in a point where, LEED buildings now are high performance, certainly, and achieving this high level of sustainability per se, but in fact, they're still clad completely in glass, steel membrane from Austria, hardware from Sweden, stone Belgian block from India, and there's a complete disjoint really on the transparency of the materials that have gone into the building.
Did you set these guys up to answer those? That's like,
I seeded it all.
that's so great. And I'll start by answering both questions at once on one phase of that, which is we don't go for certifications. We don't go for LEED. We don't, we did get a passive house certification on one of the buildings we did because we wanted to prove to ourselves that we could go through it. And oh my gosh, what a headache it was. On the project in Parcel 6 that we showed you, we didn't get certification for it. We got rebates from the utility, right, to get to pay, because we used all the eco-friendly products we used, anyway. But the point is we put our money into the project and not into the certification process. That to us seems like it holds up better over the test of time. Now, do we mooch off of the LEED standards? Like, absolutely. We follow those. We follow passive house standards, but we don't apply for them because we'd rather put as much money as we can into the building. One of the things that we do, so we develop and build our own projects until this last one, which was too big for us. But up until then, we never had a change order, right? Because we just agree, right? We're like, well, we can't afford this, so we're going to switch to this. Okay, that's fine. And we do it way ahead of time. I mean, that just goes to the integrated building design process, which has been around for decades, is a terrific tool that is underutilized. And what it does is try to put all of those problems that you're going to face before you even start building the thing, right? So the hard conversations between the contractor about they can't get this, we got to try this. All that stuff happens when you're not, and people aren't waiting around to do the next job. So streamlining the construction process, putting all the money you can into the project. Like marketing, we don't market. It's it costs too much money and it works, right? I mean, it's just, we set it up and now we have a reputation. So people are coming to us. But so in part, before you have the reputation that helps get you the clients that you need to get the money that you need so you can do your project, that's the trickier part. And that's where you have to if it doesn't pencil out, as they say, right? If you do the development project deal and you look at it and you're like, we're not going to make any money off of this, why should we do it? That's the hardest moment. And in that moment, I feel like that's when you really have to, get construction costs down and just try to push the project through and get a name for yourself.
All right. Let's thank Peter for his talk.
Thank you.